Hi, this is Aaron Azarod, and welcome to the 152nd episode of the Truth Island podcast. Legitimacy is perhaps the single reason why anyone does just about anything. We use money because we believe it carries a certain weight or legitimacy. We abide by the rulings of courts because we believe they carry legitimacy. And we value our property because each of us believes that we have legitimately earned it. Most of these issues of legitimacy derive from the fact that we believe we live in a government which is founded upon legitimate grounds. We believe that the country that we live in follows a unique and high moral standard, and thus its laws are also cut from the same cloth. Because we ascribe a certain fairness and high moral standard to our nation, it allows us to submit voluntarily to its yoke, as that yoke is not derived from the barrel of a gun, but rather out of a general welfare for humanity. However, in these uniquely polarizing times, the question of legitimacy falls into question. With many people both on the left and right thinking the US is no longer protecting the interests of the innocent, many people begin asking questions. There is both a positive and negative effect which is created when people begin questioning the world they live in. The positive is that we allow ourselves a special opportunity to correct all that is wrong and dysfunctional with the country we currently inhabit. The negative, however, is that we open the doors of instability and plunge ourselves into unknown territory. Joining me to help understand the issue of legitimacy, I am joined by Brett. Brett, do I have a legitimate reason to be concerned with what's going on in America right now?
Yeah, I would say that you do, Aaron. I would say that you do. I think that legitimacy is how we justify not just to ourselves, but to everyone around us, because we are a fairly social species, how we justify to others what we're doing, why we're doing it, and why we're allowed to be doing it. I mean, much of our society is based on these kind of like transparent rules that we all agree on, and that's where legitimacy comes from, is like, are you following the rules as have been set forth?
I think that there's something that kind of underlies rules, though. The reason that we follow rules is not just for the sake of following these rules, is that we believe that there's a moral, or like we believe there's a higher component to those rules. So we believe that those rules have a reason, like they're there to protect us. They're here to protect the innocent, or they're here to make sure that justice is served, right? So we have like these
Yep.
higher virtues that are kind of supporting those rules, right? So I'm wondering that, like, and this is like anything. Like, I'll give you an example of this. Imagine, I'm sure this happened when you were younger, that your mom or dad said, "I want you to clean your room because I said so." And what does every kid say when their parent walks into the room and says, "I want you to clean your room because I said"? Why should I do that? Right? There's a why. Why? And I think that in America, we're coming to a point where we're starting to ask those questions of like, why? Why should I be doing this? Why am I following this? And I think it's harder to create legitimacy. It's harder to enforce the rules when those why questions aren't being answered.
Yeah, yeah. I think that in addition to that, people are finding that so the rules tend to fall apart when people perceive other people to not be following them. Like, the game only works when we're all playing. When as soon as someone is exempt, it becomes unfair, and then people want to kind of like, it's like, well, if why should I clean my room when you're not cleaning your room? That doesn't seem fair, and that will really cause you to question why restrictions have been placed on you. In this case, the restriction of having a messy room. And so it's like, especially to like in the modern era, like, people are noticing all of these like unfair loopholes to the rules, and it's damaging the legitimacy of the entire system.
Right. So we have like, and I think that is, as a teacher, I always kind of experience this, like where one kid will be like, "You didn't tell him to be quiet. You only told," right? So if the rules are not being like evenly distributed, then people stop following those rules because they feel that a certain class of people is enjoying like a certain favoritism, and that kind of like leads people to start breaking the rules when they feel that one group is exempt from the rules and yet they are beholden to those rules. The same thing happens in if we think about like France, right on the cusp of the French Revolution. The nobles at that time paid zero taxes. They paid zero taxes, whereas everyone else was forced to pay not only taxes but stiff taxes. So this idea of why does this group of people have an exemption status whereas everyone doesn't? Do you think that we see things like that going on in the United States right now, where like certain classes of people are privileged from the rules, and that is causing everyone else to sort of question whether the game is fair?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're with I mean, like with all of the publicity that certain billionaires have been getting lately in regards to the slack they get for committing pretty heinous crimes, right? I think they're like mostly getting away with it, right? And yeah, people are really fed up with that. Definitely, especially when it's someone who like shouldn't need to bend the rules, is bending the rules. It can really feel well. So at first, it could feel like it's unfair, right? It could be like like why does this person get away with something that I don't get away with? But when enough of them are bending and breaking the rules, it can get even worse. It can go from feeling unfair to feeling like it's intentionally set up that way to just, it's like to use your previous example, it's like imagine you have a sibling and they don't have to clean their room, and you find out that the reason they don't have to clean their room is because they need the time that they would have been using to clean their room to like raid the fridge for snacks, right? And it's like not only do they get an unfair exception to the rule, they're using their unfair exception to get one up on top of you. And I think that's what people are noticing now more than ever is this idea of like not only are people cheating, they're cheating directly at your detriment.
This area is the most prevalent in taxation. Remarkably, the United States, I think it's been since 1910 or 1912 we've had the graduated income tax. And we all know that like you start paying 33% in taxes at a remarkably low level. I think like in a place like New York City, it kicks in at like once you earn 50 grand or something, right? Which you and I are both New Yorkers. We know that 50 grand it doesn't take you all that far in this wondrous city of ours. And you're paying 33% of your income in taxes, whereas billionaires are paying zero. And that's creating a legitimacy crisis because it's not even as if the billionaire is paying the same as you. They're paying less or nothing at all. And I think that this is causing people to be like, why am I working so hard? Why am I paying into this system when others are exempt from that, which is exactly the cause of the French Revolution. It wasn't just that people were starving in France that caused people to string up King Louis XVI. It was the fact that there was an entire class of people that were protected from paying anything. And that actually strikes at the foundation of legitimacy, right? In order to have legitimacy, I think legitimacy is tied with fairness or justice, right? I think the two, they're not the same word, but I think that they're kind of interrelated. And when you don't have justice in a system, you start losing legitimacy. So what do you think about that relationship between justice and legitimacy?
Like even in systems of government where the government's very oppressive, there's still always at least a little bit of a consensus between the rulers and the ruled on like allowing themselves to submit to supplicant to a king or a president or an emperor or whatever, right? And I think that people do that because they feel like their lives will be better under that system, right? Like being the bottom of a totem pole in a community is still probably better than just like being free and on your own, just because that sounds really wonderful, but like you'll have to catch your own food and start your own fire and build your own shelter, and that might be beyond the realm of what you're capable of doing. And the justice part, I think, comes in when you start to consider that, like, okay, The government is, they have some rules that they set up. They say it's for everyone's benefit, but I notice that it's really only for a few people's benefit. It's not for me. And that's I think that's what you're kind of getting at, right? Is that idea of like they don't get justice, right? Essentially, they're finding out that they're being used instead of partaking in a community.
You actually made, I don't know if you're aware of this, but you actually made a very good utilitarian argument that, let's just say, for example, I'm a peasant and I'm starving. I'm absolutely starving. And I find a king. I enter this kingdom, right? And I know that the kingdom is unfair, but then I kind of weigh my options. I'm like, okay, what are you going to decide? Are you going to decide to starve to death? Or are you going to participate in this corrupt system? And like, it is corrupt, right? Like these vassals, these nobles are living way, way, way better than you, but it's better than starving to death, right? To participate in this corrupt system. I guess with every system, there starts becoming a breaking point where the corruption or the lack of justice or the lack of legitimacy, it's almost as if you come to a point where you're like, well, I'm just better off starving at this point than participate in this high level of corruption or this high level of legitimacy. And it is a question, like I think each of us has a certain threshold for putting up or tolerating corruption or a lack of justice. But I do think that it does reach a breaking point where mentally, I think the mind gives out before the body does.
Oh yeah, I think that it's kind of like, you know what it's kind of like. You just gave me a good idea. It's kind of like having a job, living under the yoke of any government or any system is near identical to having a job. You're essentially expected to contribute in some way, and you're compensated in some way for your contributions. Now, with a job, it's much more straightforward. You contribute directly to the business and you are paid with money, right? With the community, the contributions are they're not exactly the same like that. They're like a little bit more esoteric, a little bit more nebulous. There are more things like behaving yourself in public. There are things like not stealing, following the law, paying your taxes, I guess, right? And then the benefits, you don't get paid in money per se, rather you get paid in having security in your neighborhood, having nice parks, having blah blah blah. So like a job though, it's like theoretically there's always a better job. There's always a better life out there for you if you're willing to look. So it's not a question of like are you living in like the best possible scenario, because you never will be. There's always room for improvement, right? Even the highest of kings can still have a better life for themselves in one way or another. It really is a question of like, what's the threshold where you'll start looking? When will things get bad enough that you'll be like, okay, I'm still alive technically, but I want to see what else is out there because I'm not super thrilled with what's happening right now. Because when you reach that threshold, in my opinion, that's when the legitimacy actually breaks. It's not when you find that new job. It's not when you essentially, in this analogy, overthrow your government. It's when you decide, I think I could do better. I should just look into it. Because it's when you look into it is when you realize, like, you start to compare stuff and just kind of like realize how big of a gap there is between what you have and what you could have.
Okay, I love what you're saying, actually. So it's like essentially if you're a peasant and there's only one kingdom in town, well, then you just don't have the knowledge or the wisdom to know of a better way of life. There's only one kingdom in town, and that's the only way that there is or has been for a very long time. So you don't have the insight to look elsewhere. It only becomes a problem when you start talking to one of your friends who lives in another kingdom, like, oh, well, my king allows me to do this, or my king allows me to have every Saturday and Sunday off, right? Then your mind starts being filled with alternate possibilities, right? And in the United States, we have Western Europe that, has more perhaps egalitarian or socialist programs and so forth. So that's filling our mind with ideas, right? We're being filled with those ideas. It also could be that people could just have ideas. They may not have been enacted anywhere in the world, but we just have these ideas. And there's always that question of like, well, why can't we do that? even though it's never been done, there's always that question of like, well, I have this idea, what's wrong with this idea? And then it's up to the government to then refute that idea and be like, okay, here's why we can't have universal basic income. Here's why it wouldn't work. And when the government is unable to refute that new idea, then another issue of legitimacy begins to arise.
I think part of it too is that when you say like, in your example, you have like a peasant who's like living, is he living good enough that he's going to be wondering what else is out there? There is definitely a cost to changing your system of government. There's definitely a cost to deciding you want something new, that change. And so it's got to be worth more than whatever you're suffering under now. So it's like, is colonization of Mars possible? Probably. But most Americans are not clamoring for Mars colonization right now because, frankly, it's not worth it. We don't need that much investment in that. If the climate crisis gets a lot worse, then maybe that'll change and people will start considering it. But for now, even though it is technically better, it would be a huge boon for the United States to do something like that. We're not really thinking about it. Things aren't bad enough yet, if that makes sense.
Well, hold on though, because bad is relative to where you are in history, right? So like people could say, oh, well, things are very bad in 2021, but are they as bad as the Great Depression? Are they as bad as medieval Europe? Probably not, right? Like we're not, for most of us at least, yes, times are tough. If you probably traveled anywhere else in history, you would find that life was a lot worse. So we can say that. So I think our definition of bad is relative to the exact pinpoint you are in history. So I don't know if there's material, like objective criteria that makes a situation bad. I think it's the relative feeling of what people feel. If people feel that something's bad, then it is bad. And there need not be any material criteria for something to feel bad. There could be people starving in a country, for example, and if that has always been the norm, then for them, it's always been the norm.
Yeah. The when I said bad, I meant relative to what the people are used to. Not even necessarily tied to a time period, but just like if people feel like things are bad, then they're bad. That's how that works. Is that like if they're like it's really bad, things are really bad right now, then they're going to be inspired to seek change. Whether or not we would agree that things are bad enough for them to be seeking change is irrelevant, right? It's as you said, it's dependent on the person.
So this brings me to the point of like why exactly people are feeling frustrated. Because on one hand, it's not at Great Depression levels of starvation or French Revolution levels where people were eating grass and grasshoppers in order to survive. And yet our generation is feeling really discontent. And I think what's going on, and I think what's helpful here is that you and I are both millennials. We're both in our 30s. I think what's going on here is that America has experienced some kind of regression from what was. So we know that our grandparents and our parents had a much easier go of it. Like just being able to buy a house, being able to support a family on a single income was just a lot easier in the past than it is now. So although people of America, for the most part, I'm generalizing here, are not necessarily starving to death, because there has been a regression or we've moved backwards, that's what's creating the legitimacy crisis, because we know that in the past, something great was possible, and now we're moving away from that greatness.
Yeah. And I think also part of it is that people feel we're not just moving away from that greatness, but we're moving away from that greatness because other people are taking advantage of a system that we all agreed on. For example, when a billionaire takes advantage of like, local tax laws to not pay taxes because they register themselves as like a new business. And it's like, technically you're not breaking the law by not paying taxes, but like we all know that you're just like a subsidiary of Walmart or Amazon, right? And you're not really a new business. And then they're like, but they have lawyers who can help argue that case that they are and take advantage of these laws that were meant to help us, but are instead helping them, right? And then it's like, that feels unfair. That's when the legitimacy starts to go out the window. If things are bad because things are bad, like, it's just like a rough season for farming, or because of an outside invasion or something, then I don't think people necessarily are going to question the legitimacy right away.
What you're saying kind of reminds me. There's a famous, I think he was a political scientist. He might have been a sociologist. I forget his name right now, but he believed in something called the generational contract. And that is this idea that you see your father doing something like living an upright life and reaping the rewards of that upright life. So and to put this in an American context, you see your father, he gets a decent paying job, he pays off his mortgage, he has a good pension, and then that father passes on the generational contract to the son, meaning like, okay, you see how I lived, you saw I had a decent home, you see I had 2 cars and whatnot. Do you think that when these corporations do what you just said, like they set up fiat companies and do all this stuff, they're kind of undermining and breaking that generational contract that we all instinctually knew to once exist, but now no longer exists, because they're trying to subvert the rules that were once in place.
I mean, they're sticking their hands into the take a penny tray, and they're taking all the pennies, even though they don't need them. They're taking advantage of a rule that's in place to help everyone. It's not a good feeling. It's, people don't like when that happens. People don't like when they abuse their power for that kind of stuff. And people certainly don't like when big faceless companies do it, especially when they get like backing of the government. I think that when it comes to what you were saying about the contract between like, child and parent, of like, this is how it was for you, this is how it should be for me. I agree. I think that especially when people can point the blame at a specific group like that kind of undermines legitimacy.
And like what I mean by that is to like think about how legitimacy is arrived is, let's say you are a new hire. You just got hired to this new company. And there's, let's say, an older lady or an older gentleman, and this older gentleman is a graybeard. He has gray hair and he works there. He has the nice corner office and he's been working there for 25 years. And he says, hey, I started off, working the reception desk, whatever it is, and here I am now. You can have this too if you play by the rules and so forth. And I think that generational contract gets corroded when the company says, that guy with gray hair, how much are we paying him? Oh, wait a minute. We could get someone younger in here that does the job cheaper. Away with the gray beard, right? Off with his head. So that kind of corrodes legitimacy, because we all believe that if we work hard into a system, we will become that like gray beard guy who's earning a good salary, has a good life. But when we see examples of people just being laid off at the age of 49 and everything, every ounce of sweat that they invested into that company was for nil, that starts corroding people's belief that things work in general.
Yeah, I think that that is like almost on a micro level legitimacy, and I think that same thing carries up all the way up into like systems of government, where people think like, oh, participate in local government. If I vote on things and I go into my community, I can affect change. And then like finding that they can't for whatever reason definitely hurts the legitimacy of government. I think that, if you look at examples in history, like late 1st century BC Rome, you can see this happening in real time. Well, no, sorry, we're seeing it happening in real time right now. You can see examples of it happening if you look back in history to, let's say, late 1st century BC, where the mechanisms of government, which mostly stood for centuries, starts to get eroded as these kind of like larger than life cult of personality politicians begin taking advantage of totally legal mostly legal things that are in the system for their own good. They're abusing the rules. It's not cheating, it's worse than cheating. Cheating is acceptable. If a general decides in the United States, like, I want to rule the country, and he gets like 1,000 soldiers and he marches on the Capitol, that is not a threat to American government legitimacy. It's a rogue agent trying to take over the country, and with any luck, the U.S. Army will be able to put down this what would be called a terrorist, and although he wouldn't really be a terrorist, he'd be more like a wannabe dictator. The point is that he'd be able to, the government, with any luck, would be able to put down this revolt, and that would be it, right? An existential threat would be like if the military discovered, or if a general discovered like a law that said like during times of crisis, a general can use the soldiers as keepers of the peace, and then he grabbed his soldiers and he compelled them to serve because he was like, we are in a crisis by all definitions, and I am invoking this law. And everyone else was like, this is bad. I don't like that you're doing this. And he's like, well, it's legal. You can't stop me from doing it. And now that hurts legitimacy badly, because now it's like we have to either agree that our system of government is wrong, or we have to just let this guy do whatever he wants. And then if you decide to take the route of like, no, I don't, this guy is trying to take over America, I'm going to raise an army and fight him. Now you're the one that is going outside of the law, right? And now you're fighting an uphill battle because you're not just fighting this guy who is in your opinion trying to take over the country. You're also fighting the public opinion where people think that you are, you know, you're breaking the law. You're a criminal, right? And if you follow the same route that he does, and you're like, I think that him raising this army causes an even bigger crisis, which means I can raise my own military, then you're just normalizing this already bad system. And you're just ensuring that in the future, more and more people just like you are going to do the same thing. And so that's the real crisis of legitimacy. And people bend the rules.
Okay, well, let's talk about martial law for 1 second. Let's just use your scenario of like a general saying, okay, like habeas corpus has been suspended. First off, I mean, in this country, at least, it would be the president that would declare martial law and suspend habeas corpus.
Yeah, you know what? Let's talk about the president instead of a general. That makes
sense. So let's say the president declared martial law and suspended habeas corpus. First, there would be, for that to be legitimate, there would need to be a few things present. There would have to be like a real clear and present danger for the president to do that. Like there would have to be like, hey, if I don't do this, it's end game, right? So there have to be a really clear and present danger for him to do those things. And two, it's for a very, very, very short duration of time. Martial law is not something that goes on for a decade. It's something that is used for like a few months to clean up a really, really, really yucky mess. I think the only time that it was ever declared was Abraham Lincoln, very short period of time. And it was the Civil War, which is a damn good reason to declare martial law, right? It's a civil war. So I think that if the president declared martial law, and one, there was not a legitimate threat to the country, and two, if that legitimate threat just went away and the martial law was still in effect, then there would be legitimacy in people opposing the president's power at that given point.
Well, I think your problem here, Aaron, is that you just mentioned several things that are very, very much perspective, not factual. I mean, I think that if Donald Trump said, if Donald Trump came out and said, I'm declared, not now because he's not the president, but like last year, if he'd come out and say, I'm declaring martial law, then people would be like, I don't think you should be doing this. But if he came out and said, I'm not giving the illegal aliens on the border a fair trial because they're cheating the system and we need to kind of take control of the situation, well, I would not agree with that. I don't think you would, but I know at least a few people who would be fine with that. I know at least a few people who would be fine. And that is suspension of habeas corpus. Not for everyone, but for some people, certainly. And yeah, I don't think it's as far-fetched as you're making it out to be. And I don't think it's as far away as you're making it out to be. I think that we were maybe like a week or two away from getting there anyway in real life. And when that happens, you're a step away from now. It's like, okay, if he can do it to advance his agenda, then can we do it to advance our agenda? And now you're tearing a hole through the rule book, you know.
I'm not an expert on this. I'm not a lawyer, but I think habeas corpus would only apply to U.S. citizens, meaning in order to have that benefit, you would have to be a full-fledged US citizen. So I think the danger would be, because the US, and we can debate whether this is legitimate or illegitimate, like we have areas on Guantanamo Bay, for example, where we keep people indefinitely with no unquestionable, like not the highest standard of jurisprudence, let's just say, right? So it would become, and obviously that's not a positive thing, but I think it would be like for it to be a full legitimacy crisis, he would have to suspend habeas corpus on just a person that has 100% US citizenship.
According to the 2008 Supreme Court decision, Bush v. I want to say his name was Bodemine. It was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court that basic right of habeas corpus, aka the right to challenge illegal detention, extends to non-citizens and even in foreign territory. So
okay, that I didn't know. That I did not know. Okay, so there are violations. So what you're saying then is that there are violations that have been slow, like there's been a slow breakage of law and no one is being held accountable for it.
Yeah. And that's bad, but what's worse is when once it happens, you can't put the sins back in the box once you take them out. As I kind of illustrated with the not so good general example. Once you start bending the rules, you incite other people to bend them in ways that allow them to challenge your now superior position, or you show them how well they can do bending the rules, and then they'll bend them just as much as you do until that rule is bent completely out of shape. The fall of the Roman Republic precipitated by this constant bending of rules, by this constant cheating of it's not cheating. That's the problem. It's not cheating of the system. It's like, like for example, in ancient Rome, they would their basic structure of government included essentially two presidents that they called consuls, and that was the highest office in the land. But there was one higher one that was called dictator, and dictator was like an emergency office that the Senate could appoint that would give someone supreme authority without any checks or balances for a certain amount of time to fix problems. And it was used once or twice a really, really, really long time ago in their history to like win certain wars. Like I believe a dictator was appointed to fight the war against Hannibal and the Carthaginians during the Second Punic War. And then it wasn't really used again until Sulla became consul. And then Sulla basically forced the Senate to make him a dictator so he could remold the laws of the Constitution so that his personal enemies, who he perceived as enemies of Rome, but you cannot mistake that his personal enemies, a man led by a man named Marius, his old general, to make his personal enemies like unable to control the government again. And from his perspective, it was not like a Looney Tunes evil, like I'm Emperor Palpatine and I'm taking over the Galactic Senate kind of nonsense. It was, he saw Marius as an existential threat to the empire. He saw Marius as someone who was going to provide citizenship to people that he didn't think deserved citizenship. He saw Marius as someone who was going to be stealing too much. I say too much because they were all stealing. Corruption was just a thing. But stealing too much from the Roman government. He saw Marius as a threat to the people, right? And so he used this power. He bent the rules. He made himself a dictator by kind of cajoling the Senate into doing it to knock Marius away. And it worked for like a year or two. But the problem is that once he did that, all these other people were watching and they were like, I did not realize we could do that. I had never done that before because I just assumed we couldn't do it. But now that I've seen you do it, I'm going to do it. And then right after the era of Marius and Sulla comes the era of, Pompey and Crassus and Julius Caesar. And then right after the era of Julius Caesar comes Augustus Caesar and Mark Antony. And that's it. That's it for the empire. Okay,
let's break this apart a little bit. So when a president or consul declares martial law and kind of bends legitimacy, it's never because there's a purple dragon that's going to attack the state, right? They have to come up with something that sounds plausible or slightly legitimate.
Yeah.
So I think it's the question of like, how much debate is there of whether that thing is like a purple dragon or whether it's a real legitimate threat. So I think the devil's in the details. Like, how much effort is actually put in debating whether could this really bring down the whole United States that we need to declare martial law, or is it a purple dragon? That's kind of what I think legitimacy is determined in that discourse.
I agree. I think that I might just be pessimistic, but I think that reasons can be fabricated. Like, it doesn't take a good reason. It takes just a person who has the political capital and the willingness to use it, right? And they'll just go out and they'll make up a rule. They'll make up a reason, and there'll be people who believe it. I mean, like, I don't know, take your pick: environment, abortion, civil rights, illegal immigration, corruption. Any of these buzzwords can be used to fabricate a crisis in the United States that would require martial law. And I intentionally picked things that could be on both sides.
I think it would have to meet the definition of like imminent danger, meaning like we are going to be wiped out next week danger, right? I don't know if I don't believe martial law could be declared for a longer, more, because let's take climate change, for example. Is it a danger? Yes, but I think it falls into the category of a existential danger. I don't think it's like I'm trying to get this right, because it's like, yes, it could wipe us out in the long run, but it's not tomorrow. No. We are gone kind of danger.
You're right, but you don't have to focus on martial law. This whole thing is like death by 1,000 cuts. I mean, again, we can look at real world examples. Donald Trump secured at least part of the funding for his border wall through an emergency fund that is meant to be saved for states of emergency in the United States. And that, to me, that stretches incredulity. In terms of, is this really an imminent threat to the country? But apparently it was enough that he was able to do it. And so it's like, it doesn't need to be tomorrow someone goes on TV and says like, global warming is going to destroy our country, so I am now the emperor. It comes in bits and pieces, little things like this, like using money that was supposed to be used for an emergency and using it to build a vanity project, and then saying like, well, illegal immigration is an emergency, so I have a right to use this, right? And then what's the next time this is going to happen? Who's the next person that's going to seize emergency funds or emergency powers in the name of something that not everyone agrees is an emergency?
Okay, I want you to use your maybe take off the philosopher hat and put back your historical hat. And I'm gonna ask you this question, okay? Is there any room in history where someone has acted in an illegitimate manner, right? They overextended their bound. Well, let me finish the question. So someone in history has overextended the boundaries, but then there was a course correction that put the country back into legitimacy. So I would say, like, let's just go with your example. Let's say Donald Trump acted in an illegitimate manner, but the course correction was that Joe Biden was then elected president. So once the first, like, there's a transgression that's made, right? Is it possible then for like someone to slightly err on the side of illegitimacy, but then the country just wakes up and then course corrects, and now we're back within the realm of legitimacy? Or once the first transgression is made, it's all over?
No, I think there's plenty of examples where, like, things start leaning towards anarchy and illegitimacy, and then they get snapped back. I mean, like in Rome, you have the crisis of the 3rd century, and then the tetrarchy comes right after. Not right after; it's 100 years, but the tetrarchy comes afterwards and puts the pieces back together. You have the War of the Roses in England, right? There's like a feckless king on the English throne in like the mid 1400s, and sorry, the English nobles are basically fighting over who gets control of the throne because the person who's in control has like no interest in ruling. And eventually it does get back to normal, right? It's not like it just the whole country descends into anarchy. So yeah, it happens, of course.
Okay, so that's a positive thing. So that means that every country has a certain tolerance for a bastard ruler, right? So every it's possible that you could have a bastard ruler who has nefarious ideas, but it doesn't mean that one nefarious ruler does not mean the end of the civilization. It could easily, there could be a course correct and things could snap back into the boundaries of legitimacy. So let's go back to the general question of legitimacy in the United States. There was a course correction, and now we have like a new president and so forth. Why are people still feeling that things in the United States are illegitimate, even though there's been quote unquote a course correction?
I mean, I would say the most boring answer would be there just hasn't been enough time to course correct. These things don't happen in months or even years. Maybe decades would be better. I mean, there's definitely governments, especially old governments, of which America is not really one, but it's still decently old. Old governments have momentum. It takes more than just one bad ruler to throw a country into chaos. The collapse of the Julio-Claudian dynasty in Rome was over, I would say, 3 emperors, almost like 50 total years. But yeah, so to answer your question, I don't know if this is the answer you're looking for. I would say the reason people still feel like things are illegitimate is because just there hasn't enough time passed for them to realize that it's not.
So I'm going to ask you to be a little bit of a prophet here.
Oh boy.
So 10 years from now, COVID is completely wiped out and everyone's just happily going back to their jobs. It looks like, do you think we'll ever get to a point of like what I call 90s America, like the America of your childhood, like 1995 Bill Clinton America, where everyone's just going to work, government is good, the Supreme Court is legit? Like, do you think it's possible that in 10 years from now we'll be looking back at this period and be like, yeah, it's like 1996 all over again? If you work hard and you pay your taxes, you'll buy a house, and just America will continue right on. Do you think that's possible?
I think to get back to that, yeah, I do think it's possible. I mean, like, if you look at, the Great Depression, the country bounced back from that. We bounced back from the housing crisis in 2008. I think that I don't think that we need like some kind of grand revolution to like set everything right. It feels right now, especially for us, because we have such. I mean, these things, like I said, these things happen on a very long time scale, and we are only human, and so it can feel your whole life has been one way. And it's like when someone describes, well, it used to be like this before you were born, it's like it can feel like a fairy tale, because you didn't experience it and you don't see any evidence of it. So you're like, how is this even possible? But things can course correct kind of like in a natural, quiet, slow way. I'm in my head, what I'm picturing right now is like America's move from like the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. America had ups and downs throughout all those decades. And yeah, there are some people who lived through all of them and would have had a very tumultuous economic life. But it's not like any kind of like insane civil war happened. I mean, I guess World War I and World War II, but it's not like any kind of insane war happened that like forced the economy to fix itself in America. It fixed itself because it just did, right? Just slow kind of policy changes and whatever. Amazon, there was a time when Microsoft like ruled the world. There was a time when no one could challenge Blockbuster or Sears. Things change. It feels like Amazon will be around forever. They might not be, right? Who knows? They might have like a disastrous investment thing or a bad product rollout or maybe some new technology will make a big portion of their business irrelevant, and they might be replaced by smaller companies, and you'll get back to that kind of like mom and pop economy that we had in the 90s.
There's a part of me that finds your words very comforting. And I 100% want to believe that we're going back to 90s America where there was
Well, I
legit.
didn't say we're going back. I said we could go back.
Okay, so there is half of me is like, whoa, thank you, Brett. That makes me feel really good inside. The part of me that doesn't feel so good inside is I'm not really worried about a top-down legitimacy crisis. Like, I think when we think of legitimacy crisis, we think of a corrupt ruler or a corrupt president just completely going haywire. I'm actually not worried about that scenario. I'm actually worried of the scenario where people get poorer and poorer and poorer and poorer, and AI comes and replaces people's jobs. And there's a whole bunch of unemployed men, and they have nothing to do all day, and they have no money. That's the kind of, like, when I think of a legitimacy crisis, that's the legitimacy crisis that I'm afraid of. I'm not so worried about some corrupt guy becoming president and taking over the whole show. I'm more worried about, like, we're going to have legions of unemployed men with nothing to do, and that's going to be a legitimacy crisis.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. Well, so I'll start by saying this, that we're not even close to the first generation to undergo some kind of like insanely radical automation revolution, right? I mean, like the printing press put, thousands out of work and changed the game of information forever. And the assembly line, the steamboat, the engine, like we are not unique. People think that the internet is this totally new invention. I mean, I guess it is. It's not like they had the internet in medieval times. But what I mean is that this idea of like this new piece of technology that's changing the world has just been revealed. This is not new. And I would even argue that the internet's not even like the biggest one. I would probably argue that the printing press was a bigger deal, or even like the combustion engine, right? But the point is that this has happened before. And when the combustion engine was invented, there wasn't suddenly just like, oh, now the people with the means to own engines are running the show and everyone else is just a pauper. Like, we got through it. We were okay. Same thing with the printing press. People were able to kind of like still be successful, even though if you owned a printing press, it meant that you owned the ability to print out tons and tons of information. You basically controlled the flow of information, right? We got through that. So I wouldn't be too worried about that. Like, it's just like a side note, it's like as the technology becomes better and better, it becomes more and more accessible. So like AI taking away jobs, at a certain point, that AI will be available to you as well. You'll be able to leverage it to do things that you want to do. It'll directly improve your life. It probably already is, to be honest.
So I guess my concern is this: low-level AI at this point, and as we're talking in 2021, can already write very basic legal memos. It can already write a basic legal memo, and it's projected.
I don't like the term AI. I prefer. Can we use the term machine learning?
Sure, machine.
AI is like a sci-fi thing. It's like a buzzword. It's not. There are no artificially intelligent robots. No one's building them. We're not even close to even wanting to build them. They're not a thing. It's a movie thing. Machine learning is the real thing.
Okay, can I just say machines? Would you be okay with that?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So we have machines now that can write low-level legal memos, and it's projected that these machines would be able to write like the equivalent of a novel by 2053. And I read it.
What would be a better way to say it is algorithms. We have algorithms
that
can write.
Beautiful. Okay.
Because that's what it is. They're basically math equations, right? So it's like a really complex math equation that lets you do what you just said, write a law memo.
Okay, so we have algorithms that can write low-level legal memos, and then it's projected that these algorithms will be able to write like the equivalent of a best-selling novel by 2053. Mm-hmm. And if you're a computer programmer, you'll have a job, okay? Like there'll need to be people to maintain the algorithms, modify the algorithms, write new algorithms. But what the hell does everyone else do? Like I can see the computer programmers always having a job maintaining the algorithms. But if even a lawyer, like there's technology right now where there's algorithms, for example, that are better at spotting cancer than a doctor's eye, right? Like there's algorithms that can actually diagnose illnesses, spot cancer. So this is what I am kind of leaning towards, of what happens when we get to this level where the algorithm is not just doing like the factory work, but it's also doing the work of lawyers, it's doing the work of doctors. The only people I see having a job are the computer programmers. I mean, good for you guys. What the hell does everyone else do?
Well, you're not a doctor, I don't think, right?
No.
So this benefits you. Like you will in the future, you'll be able to get diagnoses without having to pay for a doctor. That improves your quality of life. It'll at first be something you'll have to pay for, but the technology will eventually get so good that it'll become free. You'll just have it. It'll just be part of your life. You won't even think about it anymore. As the technology gets better, the accessibility increases. To answer your question of like, what are they going to do? As the world gets more complex, I would ask the same question as like, what happened to like, as refrigeration became more advanced and more widespread, what happened to the milkmen? What happened to the book binders when the printing press was invented? What is happening to the newspaper industry as the paperless revolution is taking off? When the self-driving car becomes like a totally real thing that everyone is doing, what's going to happen to the insurance industry that services people who get into accidents? Because there'll be no need for it anymore, because it's not your fault if your car gets into an accident. You didn't do it, your car did it, right?
Yes.
It's like an under warranty thing. And that's too complicated. Unfortunately for me, that's too complicated of a question to answer. I honestly can't give you a good answer. The only thing I could say to you is that industries have come and gone in the past, and the world seems to be okay in terms of that. I would have to look up, but I would imagine wealth inequality, even though in this in a micro sense, it's currently concentrating. If you look at like a broad stroke of like, let's say 100 years, it's probably been spreading. The planetary wealth has been spreading. And that's the other thing too, that's worth mentioning, because since we're talking about keeping jobs, you're essentially talking about resources, right? Even though it feels like resources are a finite thing, and they are realistically, they also have like an elasticity to them. Making it easier to get a diagnosis from a doctor generates more resources than it loses. One doctor who's making, let's say, $100,000 a year will lose their job, but literally thousands and thousands of people will be able to get diagnoses for free. And so you can look at that as wealth has been generated.
And I applaud that, and I think we're going to be living in wondrous times when that happens. The problem that I think most people are feeling is they kind of just want government to step in and say, we're going to have some kind of universal basic income or some kind of mechanism that will allow you to enjoy the fruits of this technology, but all of your needs will be provided for. And so far, no one has stepped in and actually said that. And I think that's what's actually causing this existential angst, is that no one is actually stepping in and saying, okay, once all of these machines come in and start doing diagnostic work, legal work, writing novels, directing movies, whatever it is, there's going to be a mechanism in place that will take care of your basic sustenance. Because no one has stepped in and said that, I think it's driving people kind of crazy, right?
Oh,
and
yeah.
it could be really solved easily by saying, okay, once these things kick in, governments around the world will step in and we will support you guys. The fact that this has been just a giant question mark is really annoying. And I kind of feel like if this doesn't get tackled soon, people are going to start going a bit haywire.
I agree. I think so. I had mentioned that like there have been these kind of technology revolutions in the past, and that was not a lie. But what I didn't mention is that a lot of them were accompanied by some pretty heavy social upheaval, which is not always the most pleasant thing to live through. Like, yes, it's the natural way of things that it's the natural way of things that technology keeps moving forward, and if you don't, either get on board or get out of the way, right? But it's also pretty painful for the people who have to live through it while it's happening, and it's 100% the job of the communities, and then to be more macro, the job of the government, which is basically the big community, to soften the blow, because it's like it's the same, it's like saying like like everyone needs to get chicken pox because it'll protect you in your old age. But that doesn't mean that you need to get chicken pox and then go live out in the woods and suffer through it. You should try to make that transition as comfortable as possible, And I agree with you. I think it would be good if we could come to some kind of consensus about how we're going to treat ourselves when this stuff starts hitting the fan. I think that whoever comes out on the other side will greatly benefit from the transition, but the people who have to live through the transition, they might be a little worse for wear without help.
I 100% hear you, and I agree with you. So I think that the transition could be softened by some forward thinking, right? Because I think that we're sort of in the phase of denialism right now, where we're in denialism about machine learning, about climate change and so forth. And I think that the sheer act of being in denialism causes people to worry, and it causes them to act fairly carelessly. And that can actually lead to some serious ugliness. Like if governments don't have a okay, in 20 years, we're going to have this kind of attitude. If that's not their attitude, I think there's a legitimacy crisis in there. It doesn't mean that solution is going to be implemented tomorrow, but if for example, today, Joe Biden got on the airwaves and said, okay, we are rolling out UBI. We hope that to expand this. And I think people would just be like, oh, finally. And they would just kind of relax, and they would have less anxiety. They would have less anxiety about the future because they know, the government's on top of it. They're slowly unraveling this. But the silence, because our government officials are just completely silent on these issues, that's actually creating much more of a storm than necessary. It's almost as if imagine you have this, I know I'm rambling a lot, but just hear this scenario. Imagine you're a kid and you're really, really hungry and you're sitting at home alone. Imagine it's 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock. Now imagine your parent calls you at 7:30 and says, hey, sweetie, I've just been delayed at work, but I'm bringing home Chinese food. You're going to feel okay. You're going to be like, all right, my mom just called me. She's delayed. She's bringing home Chinese. Even though I'm feeling really hungry right now, food is on the way. Whereas if your mom just doesn't call you at all and doesn't tell you that food is coming, you're going to start going batshit crazy and you're going to start to worry. So that's where I see the legitimacy crisis coming in, is not that we'll get through it, but that governments are not even taking any kind of preemptive lip service to kind of calm the people.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think there's a substantial group of people who disagree with UBI specifically, since that's what we're talking about, and would be more alarmed to discover that we're doing UBI. They see it as a drain on our already limited resources. They don't think that that's the path forward. And so I think that one of the causes of government inaction here is indecision, right? We have a very schizophrenic country right now. We can't seem to agree on anything. And I think UBI would be great, but I personally know people who would never vote for anyone who supported anything even resembling UBI. They see it as a waste of money.
Maybe it's my lack of imagination here, but I think that, and this is my prediction, I think I see two scenarios for this country, okay? The first scenario is that we just say, here's what the future is going to look like. You need to have a vision for the future. It can't just be oh, we'll see how it goes. You can't run a country based on I'm going to hop in my car and I'm going to just keep driving and I'll see where I end up, because that doesn't make people feel good, right? You can't run a country that way. So I see two scenarios for this country. Here's what the future looks like. Okay, we might have some hurdles, we might have some problems along the way, but this is the vision. This is the vision that we're heading towards. Everyone get in, put your seatbelts on. It's not going to be a perfect road, but we have a vision. As long as there's no vision as to the future, though, I do not see us going back to 1995 tranquility America. I don't see 1995 America coming back if there's no vision. It doesn't matter if that vision is perfect or imperfect. With no vision, there is no future. And I think the thing that is really needed to save us is vision. And I think all legitimacy can be solved if there's a vision moving forward.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
absolutely agree.
Brad, thank you so much for tackling this issue of legitimacy with me.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
This concludes the 152nd episode of the Truth Island podcast. I'm Aaron Azrod.